The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls as Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the general store window. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the tall figure of Jake Brennan loading supplies into his wagon. The rancher's broad shoulders moved with practiced efficiency, each motion deliberate and strong. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs like a caged bird. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks, ever since the Apache raids had started getting closer to town. Jake was the only man brave enough to make the dangerous journey to Fort Collins for medical supplies. Dr. Henderson had been clear about what would happen if they didn't get the medicine soon. Half the children in Cedar Falls were fighting the fever, including Sarah's little brother Tommy. The bell above the store door chimed as Sarah pushed it open. The wooden planks creaked under her boots as she stepped onto the boardwalk. Jake looked up from securing a canvas tarp over his supplies. His weathered face showed surprise at seeing her approach. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," Jake said, tipping his worn hat. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who spent more time talking to cattle than people. "Mr. Brennan." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I need to speak with you about your trip to Fort Collins." Jake's blue eyes narrowed slightly. He had heard the stories about what happened to travelers on the mountain passes. The Jicarilla Apache had been moving south, and tensions were high. 3 wagons had gone missing in the past month. But the town needed those medical supplies desperately. "What about it?" Jake asked, though he had a feeling he knew what was coming. Sarah took a deep breath. The words she had practiced in her mirror that morning seemed to stick in her throat. Around them, the town was coming alive. Mrs. Henderson swept her front porch while keeping one eye on their conversation. Old Pete sat in his usual chair outside the saloon, whittling and listening. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm. "I know about the children," Sarah said finally. "About the medicine they need. And I know you're the only one willing to make the journey." Jake nodded slowly. "That's right. Someone has to do it." "Please," Sarah said, stepping closer. "I need to go with you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Jake's hand stopped moving on the rope he had been adjusting. In the distance, a crow cawed from the church bell tower. "That's not possible," Jake said firmly. "The trail is too dangerous for a woman." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had expected this response, but it still stung. "I can ride as well as any man in this town, better than most." "It's not about riding ability," Jake said. "There are Apache war parties out there. And worse. Which is exactly why you need someone watching your back," Sarah shot back. "Someone who can handle a rifle." Jake studied her face. Sarah Mitchell was known around Cedar Falls for her sharp tongue and sharper aim. Her father had taught her to shoot before he died in the mine collapse 2 years ago. But taking a woman into Apache territory was asking for trouble. "Why?" Jake asked. "Why do you want to risk your neck on this run?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "My brother Tommy. He's got the fever. Dr. Henderson says without the medicine." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jake had seen the boy around town. Skinny kid with freckles and a gap-toothed grin. Always getting into some kind of mischief with the other children. The thought of losing him to the fever made Jake's chest tight. "I'm sorry about Tommy," Jake said gently, "but the answer is still no. I can't put you in that kind of danger." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger and desperation. "You don't understand. This isn't just about Tommy anymore. Look around you." Jake followed her gaze down the main street. Now that he was paying attention, he could see what Sarah meant. The town felt different, smaller somehow. There were fewer people moving around than usual. Several shops had their windows boarded up. The fear was spreading as fast as the fever. "Half the families are talking about leaving," Sarah continued. "Packing up their wagons and heading back east. If we don't get those medical supplies soon, there won't be a Cedar Falls left to save." Jake knew she was right. He had heard the talk in the saloon. People were scared, not just of the fever, but of the Apache raids, too. The combination was proving too much for some folks. "That still doesn't mean I'm taking you along," Jake said. Sarah stepped even closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. Her green eyes were intense, pleading. "Mr. Brennan, I'm not asking you to take me because I'm helpless. I'm asking because you need help. This is a two-man job, and every man in town is either too scared or too smart to volunteer." Jake looked around the street again. She was right about that, too. The mayor had asked for volunteers at the town meeting 3 nights ago. The response had been a room full of downcast eyes and shuffling feet. Only Jake had stepped forward. "It's not proper," Jake said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Proper?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "My little brother might die, Mr. Brennan. Half the children in this town might die. You want to talk to me about proper?" The blacksmith's hammer had stopped ringing. Mrs. Henderson had stopped sweeping. Even old Pete had stopped whittling. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to hear what Jake would say. Jake Brennan had always been a practical man. He raised cattle on a spread 10 miles outside town, living alone since his wife Mary died of consumption 3 years back. He kept to himself mostly, coming to town only when he needed supplies or when the community needed something that required a steady hand and a strong back. He looked at Sarah Mitchell standing there in her worn blue dress and scuffed boots. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and there were dark circles under her eyes from sitting up nights with her sick brother. But there was something else in her face, too, a determination that reminded him of his late wife. "You know how to handle a Winchester?" Jake asked quietly. Sarah's heart jumped. "Better than most men." "Can you ride hard for 12 hours straight?" "I grew up on a horse." "Can you keep your head when things get dangerous?" "I've been keeping my head since my father died, Mr. Brennan. I've been taking care of my family and working at the general store and dealing with whatever life throws at me. I think I can handle myself." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands working the rope. Finally, he looked up at her. "If I say yes, and that's a big if, there would have to be conditions." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Name them." "First, you do exactly what I tell you. When I tell you, no questions asked. On the trail, my word is law." "Agreed." "Second, if we run into trouble, real trouble, you follow my lead. No heroics, no trying to prove anything, just survival." "Understood." "Third, if I tell you to ride hard for town and leave me behind, you do it. No arguments." Sarah hesitated at this one. "I won't abandon you." "Then you can't come," Jake said firmly. "I won't have your death on my conscience along with everything else." After a moment, Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Agreed." Jake studied her face one more time. Against every instinct he had, against everything he knew about the dangers they would face, he found himself believing that Sarah Mitchell might just be tough enough to make it through this journey. "We leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "Bring enough food for 4 days, a warm bedroll, and whatever ammunition you have for that rifle of yours." Sarah's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You won't regret this." "I already do," Jake muttered. But there was no anger in his voice. As Sarah hurried away to prepare for the journey, Jake continued loading his wagon. But he could feel eyes on him from every direction. Word would spread quickly through Cedar Falls about his decision to take Sarah Mitchell along. Some folks would understand. Others would be scandalized. Mrs. Henderson approached him as he was checking his rifle. "Jake Brennan, have you lost your mind?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But that girl's got more sand than half the men in this town, and somebody's got to bring back those medical supplies." "There are proper ways to do things," Mrs. Henderson said, "and improper ways. Taking an unmarried young woman into the wilderness is improper no matter how you slice it. Then I guess I'll be improper, Jake said. Won't be the first time. Mrs. Henderson huffed and walked away, her skirts swishing with indignation. But Jake noticed that she didn't try very hard to talk him out of it. Her own granddaughter was among the children fighting the fever. As the day wore on, Jake found himself the subject of many conversations around town. Some people approached him directly to voice their concerns. Others just stared and whispered among themselves. By evening, the whole town knew about his decision. Mayor Williams found Jake at the saloon that night, nursing a whiskey and trying to ignore the stares from other patrons. "Jake," the mayor said, settling into the chair across from him. "I hear you're taking Sarah Mitchell with you tomorrow." "That's right. Some folks are saying it's not appropriate." Jake looked up from his drink. Mayor Williams was a good man, but he had always been more concerned with keeping people happy than making hard decisions. "Some folks can mind their own business. It's just that, well, what will people think? A young unmarried woman traveling alone with a bachelor? The gossip alone could ruin her reputation." Jake finished his whiskey and set the glass down hard. "Mayor, that young woman's reputation will survive a lot better than her brother will if we don't get those medical supplies. Now, unless you've got another plan for getting to Fort Collins and back alive, I suggest you worry about more important things." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Of course. I didn't mean to suggest. It's just that some of the more prominent families in town are concerned about the precedent this sets." "What precedent?" Jake asked. "The precedent of doing what needs to be done. The precedent of abandoning proper social conventions during times of crisis." Jake stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Mayor, half the children in your town are sick. Apache war parties are raiding settlements 50 miles from here, and families are packing up to leave because they've lost hope. If you think proper social conventions are more important than saving lives, then we've got bigger problems than gossip." The saloon had gone quiet. Everyone was listening now, though they pretended to focus on their drinks and card games. "I'm not saying you're wrong, Jake," the mayor said quickly. "I'm just saying that some people are uncomfortable with the arrangement." "Then some people can volunteer to make the trip themselves," Jake said. "Oh, wait, I forgot. Nobody else was willing to risk their necks for those medical supplies, except for one woman who's braver than the rest of us put together." Jake left money for his drink on the table and walked out of the saloon. Behind him, conversations exploded as people debated his words and his decision. Some agreed that desperate times called for desperate measures. Others insisted that maintaining civilization meant maintaining standards, even in the wilderness. That night, Jake sat on his porch looking up at the stars. The decision was made, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to change more than just the fate of one sick little boy. Taking Sarah Mitchell with him would send ripples through the community that might be felt for years to come. In town, Sarah was having similar thoughts as she packed her saddlebags by candlelight. Her hands moved automatically, folding clothes and checking supplies, while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. She had gotten what she wanted, but now she was beginning to understand the full weight of what she had asked for. Her mother had been dead set against the idea when Sarah told her about the conversation with Jake Brennan. "It's not decent, Sarah," her mother had said. "A young woman traveling alone with a man she's not married to. People will talk." "Let them talk," Sarah had replied. "Tommy needs that medicine." But now, in the quiet darkness of her room, Sarah wondered if she had considered all the consequences. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's disapproving look, about the whispers that would follow her for months or maybe years after this journey. She thought about what would happen if something went wrong on the trail, if they were attacked, or if Jake was hurt, and she had to make decisions that could affect both their lives. Most of all, she thought about Tommy sleeping fitfully in the next room, his small body burning with fever. Whatever the cost to her reputation or her future, she couldn't let him die without trying everything possible to save him. As dawn approached, both Sarah and Jake made their final preparations. Neither of them fully understood how this decision would reshape not just their own lives, but the entire character of Cedar Falls. The choice to break with convention, to prioritize survival over social expectations, would force the whole community to examine what they really valued most. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains when Sarah arrived at Jake's wagon with her horse saddled and her supplies packed. Jake looked up from checking his horse's hooves and nodded approvingly. Sarah was dressed in practical riding clothes, her hair braided tightly back, her rifle clean and ready. "You sure about this?" Jake asked one last time. "I'm sure," Sarah said, though her voice carried a slight tremor. Jake nodded and swung up into his saddle. "Then let's go bring back some medicine." As they rode out of Cedar Falls together, the morning mist swirling around their horses' hooves, neither of them looked back at the faces watching from windows and doorways. They had made their choice, and now they had to live with whatever consequences followed. The trail to Fort Collins wound through pine forests and rocky passes that tested both horse and rider. Sarah had been in the saddle for 6 hours, and her back ached from the constant alertness required to navigate the treacherous terrain. Jake rode 20 yards ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines and forest edges for signs of danger. They had spoken little since leaving Cedar Falls. The weight of their mission and the ever-present threat of Apache war parties made casual conversation seem inappropriate. But Sarah was beginning to understand why Jake had initially refused her request. This was not a journey for the inexperienced or faint-hearted. The morning had started well enough. They made good time on the familiar trails near town, and Sarah had felt confident in her decision to come along. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, the paths became narrower and more dangerous. Loose rocks threatened to send their horses tumbling down steep slopes, and the dense forest provided perfect cover for ambush. Around midday, Jake called for a brief rest near a small stream. Sarah dismounted gratefully, her legs shaky from hours in the saddle. She led her horse to the water while Jake studied the surrounding hills with his field glasses. "See anything?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. "Smoke," Jake said grimly. "About 5 miles northeast. Could be a campfire, could be something worse." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Apache? Maybe. Or it could be other travelers. No way to tell from here." Jake collapsed the field glasses and tucked them into his saddlebag. "We'll give the horses another 10 minutes, then push hard for Shadow Creek Pass. If we can make it there before dark, we'll have good cover for the night." As they rested, Sarah found herself studying Jake Brennan more closely than she ever had during his brief visits to town. His face was deeply tanned and weathered from years of outdoor work, with crow's feet around his blue eyes that spoke of squinting into bright sun and harsh wind. His hands were large and calloused, but moved with surprising gentleness when handling his horse's bridle. "You've made this trip before," Sarah said. It wasn't really a question. "3 times, Jake confirmed. Once for medical supplies during the cholera outbreak 2 years back. Twice for other supplies the town needed. Never took this long, though. Usually it's a hard 2-day ride each direction. What's different this time?" Jake glanced at her, then back at the trail ahead. "The Apache situation is worse than it's ever been, and we're carrying more supplies than usual. Dr. Henderson's order was extensive. Medicine for the fever, but also other medical equipment the town's been needing. It all adds up to extra weight and extra time." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. The longer they were on the trail, the greater the danger. And the slower they moved, the more likely they were to encounter trouble. "How well do you know these mountains?" she asked. "Well enough," Jake said. "My spread borders the foothills, and I've hunted up here since I was a boy. But knowing the land and surviving in it are two different things when there are hostile war parties around. They remounted and continued their journey. The afternoon sun grew hot, and Sarah found herself grateful for the shade provided by the tall pines. But the forest that offered relief from the heat also made her nervous. Too many places for enemies to hide, too many blind corners where an ambush could be waiting. As they climbed toward Shadow Creek Pass, the trail became even more treacherous. In some places, it was barely wide enough for one horse, with a sheer rock wall on one side and a drop of hundreds of feet on the other. Sarah forced herself not to look down at the jagged rocks below. It was during one of these narrow passages that they heard the first gunshot. The crack echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where it had come from. Both Sarah and Jake immediately reined in their horses, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "Could be hunters," Sarah whispered hopefully. Jake shook his head. "Wrong season, and too close to the trail." He studied the ridgeline above them with intense focus. "We need to move, now." They urged their horses forward at the fastest pace the narrow trail would allow. Sarah's heart pounded as she imagined Apache warriors moving through the forest parallel to their route, positioning themselves for an attack. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustling branch could be a signal between enemies. The second gunshot came from behind them, closer this time. Jake pulled his horse to a halt and turned in his saddle to look back down the trail. "They're following us," he said grimly. "Probably been tracking us since we left the main road." "How many?" Sarah asked, checking her rifle to make sure it was loaded. "No way to know. Could be 2, could be 20. Jake studied the terrain ahead of them. "There's a box canyon about a half-mile up. If we can reach it, we'll have defensive positions and only one way in." They spurred their horses forward again, this time moving as fast as they dared on the dangerous trail. Sarah's horse stumbled once on loose rocks, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought they were both going over the edge. But the animal recovered its footing and pressed on. The box canyon Jake had mentioned was a narrow opening between two massive rock formations. Inside, it widened into a circular space about 50 yards across, with high walls on 3 sides and only the narrow entrance to defend. A small spring provided fresh water, and there was enough grass for their horses. "Perfect," Jake said as they dismounted. "Like a natural fort." They quickly moved their horses to the back of the canyon and began preparing defensive positions behind the scattered boulders near the entrance. Sarah checked her ammunition while Jake studied the approaches through his field glasses. "I count 3 riders," Jake reported. "Still about 10 minutes out if they're following the main trail." "Apache?" Sarah asked. "Hard to tell at this distance. They're dressed like white men, but that doesn't mean much. Could be renegades, could be deserters from the army, could be Apache who traded for white man's clothes." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard stories about what happened to travelers who fell into the hands of hostile raiders, regardless of their race. The tales were not pleasant. "What's the plan?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "We wait," Jake said. "Let them come to us. If they're just passing through, maybe they won't bother with the canyon. If they're tracking us—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. The waiting was the worst part. Sarah crouched behind a boulder with her rifle ready, straining to hear any sound that might indicate approaching riders. Every minute seemed to stretch into an hour. Her palms were sweaty despite the cool mountain air, and she had to force herself to breathe normally. Finally, they heard the sound of horses' hooves on rock. Jake held up his hand for silence, then pointed toward the canyon entrance. 3 riders appeared, moving cautiously and clearly tracking the hoof prints left by Jake and Sarah's horses. The men were indeed dressed as white settlers, but something about them set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. Their clothes were dirty and torn, their faces hard and unshaven. One carried a rifle across his saddle, while the other two had pistols drawn. "Definitely not friendly," Jake whispered. The lead rider, a tall man with a black beard and cruel eyes, called out in a voice that echoed off the canyon walls. "We know you're in there! Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt!" Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. They both knew that promise was worthless. "We're just passing through," Jake shouted back. "Don't want any trouble." The bearded man laughed. "Neither do we, friend. Just want to have a conversation. Maybe share some supplies." "We're fine on supplies," Jake replied. "Now that's not neighborly," the man called. "Out here in the wilderness, travelers should help each other out. Why don't you come down here so we can discuss this like civilized folks?" Jake shook his head at Sarah. These men were clearly bandits, probably part of a larger gang that preyed on travelers in the remote mountain passes. Coming out would mean certain death or worse. "We appreciate the offer," Jake shouted, "but we've got to keep moving. Long way to go before dark." The false friendliness disappeared from the man's voice. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that, friend. You see, this here's our territory, and there's a toll for passing through." "How much?" Jake asked, playing for time while studying the canyon walls for possible escape routes. "Everything you've got," the man replied with another laugh. "Horses, supplies, weapons, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here with your lives." Sarah felt anger rising above her fear. These bandits were threatening not just their lives, but the lives of all the sick children back in Cedar Falls who needed the medicine they were carrying. "What about the woman?" called one of the other riders. "I heard a woman's voice earlier." Sarah's blood ran cold. The bearded man's eyes lit up with interest. "That's right. Almost forgot about the lady. Well, now that changes things considerable. Why don't you send her on down so we can get properly acquainted?" Jake's jaw tightened. Sarah could see the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. "That's not going to happen," he muttered. The bandits were dismounting now, taking cover behind rocks at the canyon mouth. It was clear they were preparing for a siege. They probably figured that thirst or hunger would eventually drive their quarry into the open. "Listen carefully," the bearded man shouted. "We can do this easy or we can do this hard. Send down the woman and half your supplies, and we'll let you ride out. Make us come up there and take what we want, and things won't go so pleasant for either of you." Jake looked at Sarah. "I'm sorry I brought you into this." "You didn't bring me into anything," Sarah replied firmly. "I chose to come. Still, a woman shouldn't have to face this kind of situation." Sarah's eyes flashed. "A woman shouldn't have to do a lot of things. But sometimes we don't get a choice." She checked her rifle again. "How good are you with that Winchester?" "Good enough," Jake said grimly. "Then let's show these men that they picked the wrong travelers to rob." For the next hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the canyon. The bandits tried various approaches, attempting to climb the canyon walls or rush the narrow entrance. Each time, precise rifle fire from Jake and Sarah drove them back. Sarah surprised herself with how steady her hands remained and how clear her thinking stayed despite the danger. She had always been a good shot during hunting trips with her father, but shooting at targets and shooting at men trying to kill you were very different things. Yet when the moment came to pull the trigger, she didn't hesitate. The bandits were clearly frustrated by their inability to dislodge the two defenders. As afternoon turned to evening, their shouts became more angry and desperate. "This is taking too long," one of them called to the bearded leader. "Maybe we should just move on. Plenty of other travelers on these roads." "Nobody makes fools of us," the leader snarled back. "We'll smoke them out if we have to." That threat sent a chill through Sarah. If the bandits started a fire in the dry pine forest surrounding the canyon, the smoke and flames could force them out into the open, or it could trap them in the canyon and kill them just as surely. But as darkness began to fall, something unexpected happened. They heard the sound of more horses approaching and new voices calling out in a language Sarah didn't understand. Jake's face went pale. "Apache," he whispered. The situation had just become far more complicated. Now, instead of 3 bandits, they potentially faced a much larger and more dangerous threat. But as they listened to the conversation below, it became clear that the Apache and the bandits were not working together. Harsh words were exchanged in English and Apache. The bandits seemed to be trying to explain their presence, while the Apache warriors appeared suspicious and angry. The tension between the two groups was obvious even from a distance. Suddenly, gunfire erupted at the canyon mouth. But this time, it wasn't directed at Jake and Sarah. The bandits and Apache were fighting each other. "This is our chance," Jake whispered urgently. "While they're distracted, we can slip out the back way." "What back way?" Sarah asked. Jake pointed to a narrow crack in the canyon wall that she hadn't noticed before. "It's tight, but a person on foot could squeeze through. Leads to a trail that comes out about a mile south of here." "What about our horses? The supplies?" Jake hesitated. Without the horses, they would never make it to Fort Collins and back in time. But staying in the canyon meant almost certain death once the fight below ended and the survivors turned their attention back to the people trapped above. "We take what we can carry," Jake decided. "Medical supplies are the priority. We'll have to find another way to Fort Collins." They quickly grabbed the most essential medical supplies from their packs, along with water and ammunition. The sounds of fighting continued from below, providing cover for their movements. The crack in the canyon wall was even narrower than it had appeared. Jake had to remove his gun belt to squeeze through, and even then it was a tight fit. Sarah, being smaller, had an easier time of it, but the rough rock scraped her arms and tore her dress. They emerged on a steep hillside covered with dense forest. Below them, they could still hear occasional gunshots, but the fighting seemed to be winding down. Jake led the way down a barely visible deer trail, moving as quickly as he dared in the gathering darkness. They had been walking for about an hour when they heard horses behind them. Someone had discovered their escape route and was following them. Whether it was surviving bandits or Apache warriors, the result would be the same if they were caught. "This way," Jake whispered, leading Sarah off the trail and into the thick underbrush. They crouched in the darkness, listening to their pursuers pass by. Sarah could hear at least 2 horses, maybe 3. The riders were moving slowly, clearly trying to track them by sound or scent. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away. Jake and Sarah waited another 30 minutes before continuing their journey. They were now on foot in hostile territory with limited supplies and no clear plan for reaching Fort Collins. "We need to find shelter," Jake said, as they stumbled through the dark forest, "and figure out our next move." They eventually found an overhang that provided some protection from the wind and any observers. Sarah shared her water with Jake while he studied what remained of their supplies by moonlight. "It's not good," he admitted. "We've got enough medicine for maybe a quarter of the sick children, and no way to carry more even if we could get it." Sarah felt despair creeping in. They had risked everything, and it seemed like it might all be for nothing. Tommy and the other children were counting on them, and they were stranded in the wilderness with Apache war parties and bandit gangs hunting them. "There has to be another way," she said firmly. "We didn't come this far to give up now." Jake looked at her in the moonlight. Despite everything they had been through, despite the danger and uncertainty, Sarah Mitchell's determination hadn't wavered. She was tougher than he had given her credit for, tougher than most men he knew. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it would require trusting people who have no reason to help us, and it would mean taking risks that could get us both killed." "What kind of people?" Sarah asked. Jake hesitated, then made a decision that would change everything. "Apache. There's a band that trades with some of the settlements east of here. Their leader is a man named Crow Feather. If we could reach him, if we could convince him to help—" Sarah stared at Jake in amazement. He was suggesting they voluntarily approach the very people they had been trying to avoid, the people who were considered mortal enemies by most of the settlers in their region. "You're talking about approaching Apache warriors," she said slowly. "The same Apache who have been raiding settlements?" "Not all Apache are raiders," Jake said. "Some are trying to find ways to coexist with the white settlers. Crow Feather is one of them. But reaching him would mean crossing territory controlled by more hostile bands. And even if we found him, there's no guarantee he would help us." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. They could try to continue to Fort Collins on foot, but the chances of success were slim. They could attempt to return to Cedar Falls empty-handed, but that would mean watching the children die. Or they could take an incredible risk and try to find help from an unlikely source. "If this Crow Feather has traded with settlements before," she said finally, "then he understands that white and Apache children both get sick. He understands that medicine can save lives regardless of the color of the patient's skin." Jake nodded. "That's what I'm hoping." "Then we try," Sarah said with conviction. "We find this Crow Feather and ask for his help." It was a decision that neither of them fully understood the consequences of. They were about to embark on a path that would challenge everything their community believed about Apache relations, about the possibility of cooperation between two peoples who had been at war for years. As they settled down for a few hours of fitful sleep under the rocky overhang, both Jake and Sarah knew that their journey had become about much more than just obtaining medicine. They were about to test whether courage and desperation could bridge the gap between two very different worlds. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Jake and Sarah picked their way carefully down the steep hillside. They had been walking for 3 hours since first light, following game trails and creek beds to avoid detection. Jake's knowledge of the terrain was proving invaluable, but Sarah could see the worry lines deepening around his eyes with each passing hour. They were now deep in territory, traditionally claimed by the Jicarilla Apache. Every step took them further from the familiar world of Cedar Falls and deeper into a landscape where their presence could mean instant death. But they had committed to this course of action, and turning back would mean returning home empty-handed while children died of fever. "There," Jake said quietly, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from a grove of cottonwoods near a bend in the creek. "Campfire. Could be Crow Feather's band." Sarah felt her heart racing. After everything they had been through, they were about to attempt something that most people in Cedar Falls would consider suicide. Approaching Apache warriors voluntarily went against every survival instinct that had been drilled into frontier settlers since childhood. "How do we make contact without getting shot?" she asked. "Very carefully," Jake replied. "Apache scouts will have spotted us already if that's their camp. The fact that we haven't been attacked yet is either a good sign or means they're planning an ambush." As if summoned by his words, 2 Apache warriors emerged silently from the forest on either side of them. Both were painted for war, with rifles trained on the white travelers. Sarah fought the urge to reach for her own weapon, knowing that any sudden movement would likely be her last. One of the warriors spoke in accented English. "You are far from your people, white man. Why do you walk in our lands?" Jake raised his hands slowly, palms open to show he held no weapons. "We seek Crow Feather. We come with a request, not as enemies." The warrior's dark eyes studied them intently. Sarah could feel him evaluating their every movement, every expression. After what felt like an eternity, he gestured with his rifle. "Move toward the smoke. Keep your hands where we can see them." They walked slowly toward the Apache camp, the 2 warriors flanking them at a distance of 20 feet. Sarah had never felt so exposed and vulnerable in her life. She was acutely aware that her fate now lay entirely in the hands of people her community had taught her to fear. The camp was larger than she had expected. At least 30 warriors were visible, along with women and children. This was not a war party, but a traveling band moving with their families. The sight of Apache children playing near their mothers gave Sarah a glimmer of hope. Surely people who cared for their own children would understand her desperate mission to save the children of Cedar Falls. An older Apache man approached them. His hair was streaked with silver, and his weathered face bore the scars of many battles. But his eyes held intelligence and dignity that commanded immediate respect. Sarah knew without being told that this was Crow Feather. "I am told you seek me," Crow Feather said in careful English. "It is unusual for white people to walk into our camp asking for favors." Jake stepped forward carefully. "My name is Jake Brennan. This is Sarah Mitchell. We come from the settlement of Cedar Falls, 3 days' ride to the south. Our children are dying from fever, and we need medicine from Fort Collins. But bandits attacked us, and we lost our horses and most of our supplies." Crow Feather studied them for a long moment. "Why do you tell me this? Apache children die from fever too. Your people do not share medicine with us." Sarah found herself speaking before she fully realized her intention. "Because children shouldn't die from sickness when medicine exists to save them. Apache children or white children. It doesn't matter what color their skin is when they're burning with fever." The Apache leader's eyes shifted to Sarah with new interest. He had clearly not expected such words from a white woman. "You speak of Apache children as if they matter to you," Crow Feather said. "But your people shoot Apache on sight. They would not weep if all our children died." "Some of my people feel that way," Sarah admitted. "But not all of us. And right now, I'm not thinking about politics or old grudges. I'm thinking about my little brother Tommy, who might die if I don't get medicine to him. And I'm thinking about your children too, because I can see them playing right here and they look just like children everywhere when they smile and laugh." A murmur went through the Apache camp. Crow Feather raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Your words are not like the words of other white women I have heard," he said finally. "But words are easy. Actions reveal truth. Why should I help people who would not help me?" Jake stepped forward again. "Because you're a leader who thinks about the future, not just the past. I've heard about your trading with some settlements. You know that white settlers aren't going away. But maybe, if we could find ways to help each other instead of just fighting each other, there could be a different future for all our children." Crow Feather was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing their words against years of conflict and mistrust. Finally, he spoke again. "The medicine you need, it is at the soldier fort?" "Yes," Jake said. "Fort Collins. But we can't reach it on foot in time, and we have no horses." "And if you had horses? If you had safe passage through the territories between here and the fort?" "Then we could get the medicine and save the children," Sarah said eagerly. Crow Feather turned and spoke rapidly in Apache to several of his warriors. A heated discussion followed, with some clearly arguing against whatever he was proposing. But eventually, the Apache leader raised his hand for silence again. "I will help you," he said, "but not just to give you horses and send you away. My band will accompany you to the fort and back to your settlement. This will ensure your safety, and it will also allow us to see how your people respond when Apache bring medicine to save white children." Sarah felt her heart skip. The implications of what Crow Feather was suggesting hit her like a thunderbolt. They wouldn't just be returning to Cedar Falls with medicine. They would be returning with Apache allies. The very idea would shock their community to its foundations. "Some of my people might not understand," Jake said carefully. "Then perhaps it is time for them to learn," Crow Feather replied firmly. "If we are to share this land in peace, both our peoples must learn that the other can be friend as well as enemy." Within an hour, the Apache band was ready to travel. Sarah found herself mounted on a sturdy painted pony, riding alongside warriors who just days ago she would have considered mortal enemies. The transition was so surreal that she had to keep reminding herself it was actually happening. Crow Feather had assigned 2 young warriors to act as her guards and guides. One was called Swift Arrow, a serious young man about her own age who spoke excellent English. The other was named Laughing Wolf, who seemed to find endless amusement in their unusual situation. "You ride well for a white woman," Swift Arrow observed as they navigated a rocky trail. "Thank you," Sarah said. "You speak English very well for—" She stopped, realizing how that sounded. "For a savage?" Swift Arrow asked with a slight smile. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I didn't mean to say that." "But you thought it," Swift Arrow said without anger. "Just as I thought all white women were weak and helpless. Perhaps we both have things to learn." The journey to Fort Collins took 2 days with the Apache escort. The band moved with incredible efficiency, covering ground that would have taken Jake and Sarah much longer on their own. More importantly, they encountered no hostile forces. Other Apache bands they met clearly recognized Crow Feather's authority and allowed them to pass without incident. At Fort Collins, the sight of Apache warriors riding openly to the gates caused considerable consternation among the army garrison. But Crow Feather's reputation as a peaceful leader preceded him, and the post commander agreed to meet with the unusual delegation. The negotiations were tense but ultimately successful. The Army had the medical supplies Cedar Falls needed, and they were willing to provide them in exchange for Crow Feather's assurance that his band would continue to avoid raids in the territory south of the fort. It was a small step toward broader peace, but an important one. As they prepared for the journey back to Cedar Falls, Sarah found herself in conversation with Crow Feather around the evening campfire. "What you're doing," she said, "coming to our settlement with the medicine. You know it will change things between our peoples." "Change is already coming," Crow Feather replied. "The question is whether it will be the change of war and hatred or the change of understanding and cooperation. Today, we choose which path to follow." "Some people in Cedar Falls will be grateful," Sarah said. "Others will be afraid or angry. Fear and anger are natural when people encounter something they do not understand. But courage and wisdom can overcome fear, just as you showed courage when you walked into our camp." The return journey to Cedar Falls was both the longest and shortest ride of Sarah's life. Every mile brought them closer to a confrontation that would reshape the community's understanding of the world around them. She found herself dreading and anticipating their arrival in equal measure. They crested the hill overlooking Cedar Falls just as the sun was setting on their 5th day away from home. The town looked smaller than Sarah remembered, its familiar buildings now seeming fragile and isolated in the vast wilderness that surrounded them. "There it is," Jake said quietly. Crow Feather studied the settlement with keen eyes. "Your people live closely together, like us when we winter in the protected valleys." "Yes," Sarah said, "and right now they're probably scared and desperate, wondering if we're coming back at all." They rode down the main street of Cedar Falls as darkness fell. Every window held a face, every doorway framed a stunned observer. The sight of white settlers riding alongside Apache warriors was so unprecedented that some people simply stood and stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Dr. Henderson was among the first to approach them as they dismounted outside his clinic. His eyes went wide as he took in the medicine packs carried by the Apache horses, then looked at the warriors themselves. "My God," he whispered. "Sarah, Jake, what have you done?" "What we had to do," Sarah replied firmly. "We brought the medicine." Word spread through the town with incredible speed. Within an hour, every resident of Cedar Falls knew that Apache warriors were camped on their main street with the medical supplies that could save their children. The reaction was everything Sarah had feared and more. Mayor Williams arrived with a crowd of angry townspeople behind him. "Jake Brennan, have you lost your mind? You've brought savages into our town, with weapons." "I brought medicine for dying children," Jake replied calmly, "and these men risked their lives to help us get it." "They're Apache!" shouted Mrs. Henderson. "They're probably planning to massacre us all once we let our guard down." Crow Feather stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the hostility surrounding him. We come in peace. We bring medicine for your sick children. We ask only for the chance to prove that Apache and white people can help each other instead of fighting." The crowd grew larger and more agitated. Some men had appeared with rifles, clearly prepared for violence. Sarah realized that their homecoming could quickly turn into exactly the kind of bloodshed they had worked so hard to avoid. "Wait!" she called out, raising her voice above the angry murmurs. "Before anyone does something they'll regret, let's remember why we're here. Tommy Mitchell is in Dr. Henderson's clinic right now, burning with fever. So are Maria Santos, little Billy Cooper, and 8 other children. They're dying while we stand here arguing about politics." She gestured toward the medicine packs. "These men didn't have to help us. They could have killed us or just let us die in the wilderness. Instead, they chose to risk their own lives to save children they've never met, children whose people have been their enemies for years. If that's not Christian charity, then I don't know what is." Dr. Henderson stepped forward hesitantly. "The medicine, is it what we need?" "Everything on your list," Jake confirmed. "Enough to treat every sick child in town and have some left over." The doctor looked at the medicine packs, then at the Apache warriors, then at the desperate faces of the townspeople. His medical oath won out over his prejudices. "Then let's get it distributed immediately. We've already lost too much time." The next few hours transformed Cedar Falls in ways that no one could have predicted. As Dr. Henderson began administering the medicine to the sick children, word spread that it was working. Fevers broke, labored breathing eased, and hope returned to families that had been preparing for the worst. But the real transformation was happening in the interactions between the townspeople and their Apache visitors. Crowfeather had instructed his warriors to help wherever they could, and gradually barriers began to break down. Swift Arrow helped the blacksmith repair a wagon wheel, working alongside him with quiet efficiency. Laughing, Wolf entertained a group of healthy children with stories and simple tricks, their initial fear giving way to delighted laughter. Other warriors assisted with various tasks around town, always respectful and helpful. Most remarkably, when word came that Maria Santos was recovering from her fever, her mother brought a pot of stew to the Apache camp as a gesture of gratitude. It was a small thing, but it represented a crack in the wall of prejudice and fear that had separated the two communities for so long. Of course, not everyone in Cedar Falls was ready to embrace this new reality. Several families packed their belongings and left town rather than stay in a place where Apache were welcomed as allies. Others remained but made it clear they disapproved of the new arrangement. But as the days passed and it became obvious that the Apache meant no harm, even some of the skeptics began to reconsider their positions. When Crowfeather's warriors helped fight a grass fire that threatened several homesteads, the last major resistance to their presence crumbled. A week after their return, Sarah stood on the porch of the general store watching Apache and white children playing together in the dusty main street. Tommy was among them, fully recovered and back to his usual mischievous self. The sight filled her heart with a satisfaction deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Jake approached from the direction of the saloon, where he had been meeting with Mayor Williams and Crowfeather to discuss a formal agreement between the town and the Apache band. "How did it go?" Sarah asked. "Better than expected," Jake said. "Crowfeather is willing to establish a permanent trading relationship. His people will provide horses and guide services for travelers heading to Fort Collins. In exchange, the town will share medical supplies and other necessities during hard times." And the mayor agreed to this? He didn't have much choice. Half the town council thinks Crowfeather's people are heroes after they helped save the children. The other half is afraid to oppose an arrangement that might prevent future Apache raids. Sarah nodded, understanding the complex political calculations involved. "What happens now?" "Now we find out if this experiment in cooperation can last," Jake said. "Crowfeather is leaving tomorrow to return to his regular territory, but he'll be back in a month to formalize the trading agreement. That gives everyone time to get used to the idea." As if summoned by their conversation, Crowfeather himself approached the store. The Apache leader had spent the week carefully observing the town and its people, measuring their capacity for change. "Miss Mitchell," he said with a slight bow, "I wanted to thank you before we leave tomorrow." "Thank me?" Sarah said, surprised. "You're the one who saved our children." "You saved them by having the courage to ask for help from people your community taught you to fear. That took more bravery than any warrior shows in battle." Crowfeather looked out at the children playing in the street. "My grandmother told me stories of a time when Apache and white people first met. Before the wars, before the hatred. She said there was a moment when it could have gone either way, toward friendship or toward conflict. I think perhaps we have created such a moment here." "I hope so," Sarah said, "for all our children's sake." As the Apache band prepared to leave the next morning, the entire town turned out to see them off. The contrast with their arrival could not have been more dramatic. Instead of fear and suspicion, there were handshakes, gifts of food, and even some tears. Swift Arrow approached Sarah as she said her goodbyes. "You changed my mind about white people," he said simply. "I hope I changed yours about Apache." "You did," Sarah replied. "All of you did." Months later, Cedar Falls had become something unique on the frontier, a settlement where Apache and white traders worked together openly and peacefully. Word of the arrangement spread throughout the territory, inspiring some communities and horrifying others. Sarah often thought about that moment when she had pleaded with Jake Brennan to take her along on his dangerous mission. She had been thinking only of saving her brother and the other sick children. She had no idea that her request would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire character of their community. The choice Jake made that morning, the choice to break with convention and trust a determined young woman, had indeed turned the whole settlement upside down. But in the end, it had turned it toward hope, cooperation, and a future where children of all backgrounds might grow up in peace. Standing on her porch at sunset, watching Apache and white children play together in the dusty street, Sarah Mitchell knew that some choices, even the ones that seem impossible at the time, can change the world in ways no one ever imagined possible.